Hey friends, Kevin here, and you know I recently did a video that a lot of people liked and got something out of, talking about 3 minivan brands to avoid. If you missed that, I'll put a link to that down in the description. But it got me thinking with a lot of questions that maybe, now that we got those out of the way, we should talk about the popular brands, because everybody wants to know, hey, what's the best minivan? What's the best one for me? Blah, blah, blah. And there's been so many made over the years. So we're going to do a set of videos. I'm going to do this basically brand by brand, manufacturer by manufacturer at least, to make it simple. And the first one we're going to do is General Motors products, which is basically going to be Chevrolets, but it's also going to fall into GMC and Buick and Oldsmobile and Saturn and all those other things under that GM banner. And we're going to talk about the different generations, what makes them different, which ones may be right for you, which ones you may want to avoid for different reasons. So let's get to it. Now, this video is basically going to be about minivans and using them for your conversion, your build for doing van life. So we want to stick with these GM products, but we have to throw one of these in here somewhere, which is a Chevy Astro van, which also has a GMC Safari, which is the same vehicle, different badge on it. Now, this was the first of these smaller vans that was made by General Motors. And technically, I don't consider this a minivan as we think of minivans. I consider this a miniature cargo van because it was rear-wheel drive. Generally, with all these other brands out there, when you think of minivans, you think about a front-wheel drive vehicle. But this Astro series of vans was a rear-wheel drive. Instead of having the lift-up hatch in the rear, it had 2 doors that swung out, like half doors. So again, it's really not what I consider a minivan, but it has to be thrown in a category somewhere, so we'll do it. And General Motors rushed this out. Chrysler basically created the minivan and started selling in '83, the 1984 model year. And when Chrysler had great success with that minivan, everybody else, every other company wanted to jump in and get a piece of that minivan market. So the first thing that General Motors was able to do in '85 to throw something out there was this Astro van. Now, this Astro van they made from 1985 to 2005, and when they started making their real minivans, I always wondered why they had a front-wheel drive minivan sitting next to a rear-wheel drive Astro van, which were basically the same size vehicles and seemed kind of redundant to me. But we'll get away from the Astros now, and we'll talk about real minivans. Real minivans from General Motors, in my view, didn't come along until 1990. And the first generation of these ran from 1990 to 1996. And Chevrolet made what was called a Lumina APV. I guess stood for all-purpose vehicle. They were trying to get that nameplate in there because they also had a car that they had the Lumina name stuck on. And there was an Oldsmobile version called a Silhouette, and there was a Pontiac version, which seemed to be more popular and seemed to be what everybody remembered, these light blue colored, especially odd vans running around because they had these big sloped windows, and it just stood out from everything else. And even though all 3 of these shared that same body style, the Pontiac just seemed to really stand out for some reason. And the name on it was a Transport. Now, this series of vans is going to be 3-door vans, meaning you have 2 front doors, you have 1 sliding door, and all of these vans I'm going to talk about being General Motors minivans are all going to have a lift-up hatch. The downfall, if there was one, for this first series of vans was that they didn't do very well in front-end crash ratings. So when they had the little dummies in the vans, they did the crash test, the dummies always ended up with massive leg injuries and foot injuries especially on their left legs from the way this vehicle would buckle in. So when the General Motors got away from this series and went to the next series, their goal was to strengthen that, which they did. A second thing that was a little bit of an issue with this 90 to 96 series of Lumina's Transports and Silhouettes seemed to be transmission problems, which I think were a little bit above average. And hey, if you have personally owned any of these General Motors minivans that we're talking about, even if you didn't use it for camping and van life, maybe when you had one back in the day, let us know down in the comments. Let us know how long you had it. Let us know whether you thought it was a good vehicle or whether it was a vehicle that caused you problems. Give us some details. Now let's get back to it. Now, to move on to that next generation, where you have name changes. This was the stuff made from 97 to 2005. So the Chevrolet vehicle became a Chevrolet Venture, which is what I have. The Pontiac stuck with the Transport name for the first couple of years, and then they decided to rename it and call it a Montana. Pontiac Montana. And they stuck with the same name for the Oldsmobile version, the Oldsmobile Silhouette. Now, the 97 to 2005 versions of these minivans come in both 3 and 4-door versions, meaning you have your 2 front doors, and you have either 1 or 2 sliding doors. My version has the 2 sliding doors, which is one of the things I went looking for in a minivan. I wanted to be able to open both of those large doors to have lots of air movement through there in the spring and summer and fall. That may or may not be important to a lot of people. I also wanted, again, a vehicle with a lift gate, so when it was raining, weather was a little bit odd, baking in the sun in some areas, I would have something to be able to get under and sit on the bumper, sit in the vehicle, and still have something to provide some shade, provide some cover with the rain. So that's why I like this particular series of van. Now, in these 97 to 05 model years, there are some that were made. I know Chevrolet made it. Can't remember about Pontiac for sure. Oldsmobile also made some all-wheel drive versions of these. The all-wheel drive versions of these are really hard to find, and the all-wheel drive versions of these had some transmission issues. So if you find that one, you have to be really careful of that, and that's why they're hard to find now, because a lot of them simply went into the junkyard. I'm assuming they were using the same transmission that they were using like in the Oldsmobile Bravada, however you want to say it, SUVs, which was basically a Chevy Blazer that was upgraded with nicer interiors and came standard with all-wheel drive. And I know a lot of those vehicles had transmission issues. And I think that's the same transmission that was used in this series of all-wheel drive vans. So again, the front-wheel drive vehicles, not a problem. All-wheel drive vehicles, check it out really well if you run into one in good shape that you're interested in purchasing. Make sure it hasn't already had or doesn't have transmission issues when you go to purchase it. Now, another thing with these 97 to 05 vehicles, it's going to run a little different. What Pontiac made, what Oldsmobile made, which generally because they were higher end vehicles, they are the long wheelbase version. The Ventures were available in a short wheelbase and a long wheelbase. And I know a lot of you have heard this term and may not be familiar with it, so here's what it is. The wheelbase of a vehicle is measured from the center of the front wheel to the center of the rear wheel. Whatever that measurement is the wheelbase. So a short wheelbase on these is about 112 inches between The center of the front wheel, center of the rear wheel. A long wheelbase version, or an extended version, is 120 inches. That doesn't sound like a lot, that 8 inches, but it makes a difference in the total length of the vehicle, which actually becomes a difference of a little more than 8 inches because of the way they're designed. So, rough estimate, a short wheelbase van is 186 inches from bumper to bumper. A long wheelbase van, like my Venture LT trim was that year, is about 201 inches. So you have an extra 14 or 15 inches of interior space there to play with. And while that still doesn't sound like a lot, trust me, it is. So if you're going for one of these minivans, you want to, again, make sure you're getting an extended version, long wheelbase version, one of the trim levels that has this, because in my setup that you've seen in my minivan build videos, if I didn't have that 14 or 15 inches of space there, when I lifted that back hatch, I would have no room for all of the stuff that you see back there. That's what goes in that 14 or 15 inches. That's where I store the toilet. That's where I store the cook stove. That's where I store my cooler and my dry food and all of these other little, my privacy shower tent, all of these other little things, my extra propane tanks, my little battery bank, all of that stuff is stored in that area. So if I didn't have that extra 14, 15 inches to play with, then that stuff would have to be put somewhere else and the van would become really, really crowded. So an important point, you want to make sure you're getting a large version of this vehicle. And the longer wheelbase, large version, it's not going to make any difference in the real world in your gas mileage. But it's going to make a big difference in your comfort level. And that, my friends, is going to bring us up to the third generation and the final generation of real General Motors minivans. And of course, with another generation of minivans, which were virtually identical to the generation before it with some fresh upgrades and a little bit better crash ratings. Again, that 90 to 96 era vehicles, not good in front end crashes. The 97 to 2005 versions, like I have, were much improved in their crash ratings. They did things to strengthen it up on the front end and on the sides. And this third generation improved yet again, a little bit safer in their frontal crash ratings. So these vans were made from 2006 to 2008, this series of minivans. The Chevrolet became an Uplander. The Pontiac Montana became a Montana SV6, for whatever that means. They tacked that name on there. The Buick version is called a Terraza, and since General Motors had Saturn at the time as a brand, they came out with a minivan finally for Saturn, same thing, called a Saturn Relay. Again, these are basically all the same except for the nameplates, then the shape of the front end and the shape of the rear lights, but everything else structurally, inside, interiors, is basically going to be the same on all four of these. As you move up the chain money-wise from Chevrolet to Buick to Oldsmobile, you get a few more niceties. You'll end up with leather seats instead of cloth seats. You'll end up with a leather-wrapped steering wheel instead of a standard steering wheel, things like that. For this last third generation of these minivans, they are all long wheelbase. So they got rid of that short wheelbase crap. So if you're in generation 3, they're all going to be the same size. They're all going to be the big size. That's going to be a plus for you. They're all going to have dual sliding rear doors, side doors, cargo doors. So they're going to be the 4-door versions, 2 front doors, 2 sliding doors, and then the lift hatch. In 06 and 07, they also made a few all-wheel drive versions of these vans. Again, the all-wheel drive versions of minivans just seem really difficult to find. I've looked at a few over the years. The Oldsmobiles that I run into all had transmission problems. I walked away from them. Going back, even though I don't really consider those Astro vans to be minivans, I've driven a couple of all-wheel drive Astro vans. They were all trashed out when I found them, just in really poor shape, poor maintained vehicle, and I walked away from those. So your mileage may vary. I have never found one in good shape yet. And what is out there, even that's not in good shape, the all-wheel drive version commands a pretty good premium. And I did a separate video a few months back on whether you really need all-wheel drive in a minivan or not. Because initially in my head, I was certain for the places I was going to go that I would need all-wheel drive. And I searched and I couldn't find a good one, and I finally gave in and just got a standard front-wheel drive van in my head that this will tide me over until I find a good all-wheel drive one, and then I'll trade. Well, I did these coast-to-coast trips. I got out in the desert. I got out in bouncing up in canyons in Utah and different places. Come to find out, I didn't need all-wheel drive. Front-wheel drive was absolutely fine for everywhere I wanted to go, even as much off-road as I do. But again, this is a choice that only you can make. If you're in a northern area and plan on spending winters in much snow and ice in the north, then it may be worth getting an all-wheel drive version. But again, you're now dealing with vehicles that are more than a decade old. A lot of stuff that comes out of the north, van-wise, like any other vehicle, sometimes you have a lot of rust issues because of the amount of road salt and different things. So all of these things tend to factor in. But hopefully this has given you a good overview of what General Motors has had to offer. Ask any questions below. Let me know if I made this video clear enough in trying to describe these different generations of these and some of the pros and cons. And if this is popular, I will go ahead and let me know also. Yes, I want you to do those, Kevin, down in the comments. And I will do some detailed videos on other brands, the Chrysler Dodge stuff, Hondas, Toyotas, which have some good years and some bad years with their minivans. Let me know if that is something you're interested in, you want to see. We'll talk soon.